Pokémon is nearly 30 years old. Since Satoshi Tajiri and the team at Game Freak created the concept from his love of bug hunting, the RPG series has become the highest grossing media franchise of all time. As with my last video on RPGs and how they evolved over time, I wanted to keep analysing Pokémon, but instead I looked at what is often criticised in the franchise, its difficulty. This started from the 5th generation until the most recent Scarlet and Violet came under fire, particularly for the lack of level scaling. The difficulty has, and always seems to have been, purely based on the level of the Pokémon that you face. So, in order to measure this, I'm going to go through each game and find the total experience that you can earn and spread amongst a team of 6 Pokemon all caught on the first route. Then I will check the average level of the player's Pokemon team against the opponents in major milestones to see how they compare. This would give us a fairly easy to understand difficulty curve over the course of the game. Since the aforementioned enemy AI and battle systems haven't changed at all in 30 years, it wouldn't really make much sense to analyse the Smogon tier lists and type weaknesses, since the trainers are coded to rarely make use of any advantages. Obviously, I'll weight it as well, as 6 level 15 Lotads are much more effective than 1 level 17 Nuzleaf. Starting back in 1966, Pokemon Red and Blue started the series with a fairly rudimentary system that hasn't changed too much over the years. Essentially, the experience formula is the base XP you get from a Pokemon times its level, divided by 7, multiplied by various factors. If it's a trainer Pokemon or not, if it's a traded Pokemon or not, every Pokemon has a base experience that it's worth. And this series of numbers changes over each generation, so that needed to be updated for each game. In Generation 2, it kept the exact same formula, but you could hold items now, so this is where the Lucky Egg is introduced, and you could have your experience multiplied by 1.5 again. Generation 3 and 4 don't really add much in terms of XP gained, as it's more about the mechanics, so Pokemon natures, double battles, and the like. Gen 5 is where the bulk of the changes to the experience formula are made. It looks a bit complicated at first, but essentially it adds experience point powers. The experience boosts come from the Entralink, which is a feature for local wireless gameplay with friends, where you can complete different missions for these experience boosts. I will assume these are not being used for my calculations, so they will stay at 1. The other major thing is level scaling. Essentially, this means the further your battling Pokemon is away from the level of your opponent's Pokemon, then it will change the multiplier. For instance, if the opponent is level 40 and you are level 35, you will get roughly a 1.15 times bonus. Similarly, if you're level 40 and they are level 35, you'll get a 0.85 times multiplier. This is to try and keep your Pokemon levels in line with the opponents for the difficulty curve of the game to remain challenging. For my thoughts, I've kept this as a 1 times multiplier, as if you're stronger, it's the same as if you're weaker, which would balance out, but frankly, it would be too crazy to calculate that for each battle. Other minor things are it's divided by 5 instead of 7 in the formula, and add in a constant 1. Gen 6 bizarrely does away with the level scaling, reverting back to Gen 1 to 4's formula, also adding some small things like if you have an unevolved Pokemon, it will gain a 1.15 times bonus to the experience if it is over the point where it could evolve but you choose not to. X and Y does add 2 key things. Affection. Slowly, a multiplier based on how much your Pokemon likes you, capping out at roughly 1.2 occurs. This happens naturally as you win games and give them items, and you can speed up the process through stroking them. Since this actually happens naturally, I'm going to include this, and for my calculations, I will guess at roughly halfway through the game, your Pokemon will love you enough for the 1.2 times modifier. Everything before is still a 1 times modifier. I think that's fair. Finally, a revamped experience share makes things a bit crazy. It used to take a portion of your experience and share it amongst your other Pokemon. Useful for training a very weak Pokemon, but not much else. But now Game Freak decided, fuck it, grinding is boring baby, let's give the same portion to all of your Pokemon. So for example, in Generation 1, it worked where if you got 10 experience from a battle, you'd actually get 5 experience, and every other of your 5 non-fated Pokemon would get 1 experience. Gen 2 made it a held item, so your Pokemon which battled would get 5 experience, and the Pokemon holding it would get 5 experience. But Gen 6 would make it that the battling Pokemon would get the full 10 experience, and every other Pokemon would get 5 experience. So that means the total goes from 10 experience in the same battle in Gen 1 all the way up to 35 experience in Gen 6. That's massive. That's adding so much to the pool of experience. And back to Generation 7, which reverts back to Generation 5's formula with the experience share and affection, and a slightly tightened up level scaling formula, which is how it has stayed until the modern day. So, let's look at the overall data. First, it's time to look at the trainers in each game. I also included any unique rematch. Generally speaking, the total trainers has been decreasing over time. If you grouped the games by consoles, so Generation 1 to 3 as the Game Boy era, Generation 4 to 5 as the DS era, Generation 6 to 7 as the 3DS era, and Generation 8 to 9 as the Switch era, not including the remakes, the average total trainers goes from 427 to 400 to 288 to 187. Also, another useful graph is this one, which shows the average Pokemon that trainers have, showing that most trainers are holding fewer and fewer Pokemon. So while there are fewer Pokemon trainers to fight, they're also fighting with fewer Pokemon. So this implies that they are reducing the overall amount of battles you need to do to grind to beat the game. This graph shows the total experience across all games, and it shows the effect of the experience share in Gen 6. Since it has a 3 times amount of total experience more than Gen 5 and before, you see that massive spike, and it basically stays there. While it is possible to disable it in a couple of the games, the director has stated that most people use it anyway, and they base the difficulty curve around this clearly in the modern generations, and so I'm assuming it is on as default for each of these games. For the base experience, the standouts are the black and white games and Gen 8 and 9, and I have 2 reasons for this. One reason that explains Generation 5 is that it's the only generation with the experience formula that divides its base XP and level by 5, and also still has the 1.5 times bonus for fighting a trainer Pokemon. So this in the calculations means that where previously you would get 78 experience from the same fight, if you ignore level scaling, you'd now get 110 experience. To explain Generation 8 and 9's spikes, if you look at the average of all the base experience for each time the generation was changed, so you see the following. It is increased every time as things are tweaked, more Pokemon are added and such. So for Generation 8 and 9, even though you had fewer fights, you gain much more experience per Pokemon. And finally, before we look game by game, here we have the final average party level for each game, which shows here that yes, your team is getting more and more powerful each game. So let's compare that to the champion in each game. Clearly, the champion's team level without rematches is above the players in Generation 1 to 4, matching very nicely in Generation 5, and then in Gen 6 Plus, you pretty much outclass the champion every time. Comparing Let's Go Eevee with Pokemon Red and Blue, you can clearly see the difference in these games from their experience formulas. Pokemon Red, you're nearly 15 levels outclassed by the champion, whereas in Let's Go Eevee and Pikachu, you're 10 levels higher than the champion at the end of the game. This is another question that might come up, is that you might be thinking, well, even if I'm 1 level lower than my opponent, I still have a pretty good chance of beating them. And you're right, because you can exploit type weaknesses, you can spam items, and you can generally outmaneuver a lot of the trainer AI, I found that typically you could probably deal with a team roughly 25% higher level than you. For example, a level 40 Pokemon could probably beat a level 50 Pokemon if you used it properly. Level 12 could beat a level 16, for example. As a sidebar, I did look into the AI of the trainer battles with a very useful breakdown in the video by Abyssofts. There are wild Pokemon, normal trainers, elite trainers, and bosses, where the regular trainers have limited movesets and will choose prioritized moves instead of making informed decisions even when you have low health. Stronger trainers like veterans and cool trainers you find in Victory Road will have a more varied decision-making process and will try to hit the Pokemon's weaknesses and be more ruthless. When you get to gym trainers, rivals and Elite Fours, they are obviously stacked with much better teams and builds. They have the ability to use items, use combinations of buffs and attacks, along with stab moves being utilised properly. Then you get to Gen 2 and Gen 3 and beyond, where the trainers are given smarter builds based on the movesets. This is slightly better, but unfortunately, since the moves are all what the specific Pokemon can learn, and there is nothing that the player themselves cannot learn, this means that Game Freak struggle to make any fights memorable. Your traditional RPG wouldn't hesitate to give a boss a strange moveset or mechanics, since it is meant to be an obstacle, whereas the Pokemon all have to fit in within the framework provided. For example, they don't break the moveset and give Hypno full sleep moves and buff percentages around different strategies. They will just have the 4 moves that Hypno could learn at that level. Totem Pokemon sort of try to change this, but nothing really makes them mechanically interesting. I just wish they took the time to twist the mechanics, even if the player wouldn't have the ability to actually use it in a future fight. Starting with Pokemon Red and Blue. It shows that if you fight every possible trainer, you will have a fairly over-leveled team right up until you fight the Elite Four, which will be considerably more challenging. Blue will be the strongest challenge as he has 6 powerful Pokemon instead of 5 from each of the Elite Four, giving you a 16.3 level disadvantage against him. Leaf Green and Fire Red follow the exact same shape as Red and Blue, which makes a lot of sense, the only difference being that there is a couple of few extra trainers to battle as there are now rematches introduced. So with these unique rematches, there's basically an extra 80 fights to have. This still leaves a decent level disadvantage against the champion, however. Then, Let's Go Eevee and Pikachu is where we see the most interesting change. This is where we see the experience share change and the Affection XP added to the experience formula from Gen 6, which has a major impact. You also gain experience from catching Pokemon, which clearly is in the player's favour here, but I've kept it to just obviously the 5 Pokemon you catch in the first route. Here we see that the champion is the only challenging fight without affection and experience share, but since you cannot turn off experience share, your team average is 15.2 levels higher than the champion. The total trainers is 342, so this is a very good comparison to the original. There's no rematches or anything. This just shows how incredibly powerful the experience share makes your team and how trivial the challenge becomes in modern games when you don't balance the game accordingly. With the second generation, there are a couple of interesting things to talk about. Obviously, one being that you can now rematch trainers that you fought previously after different milestones in the game. The second thing to look at is after you beat the Elite Four, you go back to Kanto and fight each of the gym leaders before fighting Red as a sort of secret final boss. So it follows a similar path to Red and Blue, where you get slowly stronger until you reach the Elite Four, and that the levels seem to be very close to the opponents. Then you will fight Lance, the Elite Four champion, whose Pokemon will slightly outclass yours. Finally, then you go to Kanto. The Kanto trainers are much easier, with everyone being around mid-40s except for Blue. This probably comes from the multiple routes that you can travel around and challenge at each point. And then finally, it comes to Red, the secret final boss. This is categorically the most difficult fight. Fighting Blue, the average level of their team is 56.7. When you fight Red, it jumps to 76.7. So grinding is essentially a must to challenge this secret boss. By far the hardest trainer in any game. You could maybe point out to a Morimoto or Battle Frontier fights, but this is technically part of the story. Then comparing this to its remake of Heart Gold and Soul Silver, it obviously follows a similar pattern. Fairly manageable, and then when you get to Lance, it has a bit of a difficulty spike. But it's far more forgiving in the rematches, which you can see in Johto. There are almost 100 more rematches, so you can see this spike when you get to Kanto. With more trainers to fight, you'll gain more experience, but still, when we get to Red, things get crazy. With an average team level of 83.7 and Pikachu at level 88, this is mental compared to every other trainer fight you'll fight in any other Pokemon game. It's the trainer with the highest difference in favour of the opponent to any game, a 31.2 level disadvantage in Gold and Silver and 31.7 disadvantage in Heart and Soul. But even with rematches, it's a 23.5 level difference in Heart and Soul, but Gold and Silver remains 29.2 difference. Generation 3 is quite interesting as this is pretty much the same curve as Generation 1 and 2, and it shows that with rematches, you're only 5 levels at a disadvantage against Steve and Stone. Then Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire completely changed this, as we saw with Let's Go Eevee, where the experience share makes a completely massive change to things. But this is actually the only game in the series where you have this adjusted experience share and you could rematch trainers. So we see that this does trivialise the story a bit, with at Steven, you could be 20 plus levels more powerful than he is. Generation 4 doesn't have much to discuss. It follows the same pattern as Ruby and Sapphire pretty much. Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl does remove the rematches, not deeming them necessary with the new experience share. Generation 5 is where we see quite the lack of balance from Game Freak. Every battle is basically getting more and more easy until you reach N and Getsis, which almost become fairly balanced for where you should be. Black and White 2 showing this possibly even more, where essentially after the first gym you're nearly always 10 levels on average stronger than your opponent, with very rare spikes back down to 0, but these are for opponents that have 6 Pokemon. If you think that's a bit mean, for context, if you just kept your starter, it would be level 96 by the time you reach the Elite Four, which would probably one-shot everything it comes up against. So I think I'm being more than fair. Now we get to Generation 6, Pokemon X and Y. The experience share is changed and affection is introduced, but even without them, the only real challenge here you will face will be in Diantha. But with both experience share and affection applied, this means that this is the first game in the whole franchise where you'll probably have a higher level team than every major trainer you fight, a trend which unfortunately will continue to the modern day. Sun and Moon show this in full effect, with the base experience actually following the previous curves closely, but with the added boost to the EXP, this makes your team too strong. The champion Kukui being the closest challenge, only being 4.5 levels lower on average than the players. Ultra Sun and Moon, on the other hand, is pretty much a cakewalk with experience share and affection from the get-go. There is an instance in modern games where the party's level with experience share and affection is below the opponent's, which is Sword and Shield against Leon, where the average level jumps from Rose from 46.3 to 63.3. This is because he's the only fight in the game holding 6 Pokemon. There are only 148 trainers in Sword and Shield. Of these 148 trainers, you must fight 53% of them. So, the experience players would fluctuate far less. Most other games have around 20 to 30% mandatory fights, but inexplicably Sword and Shield has something against these optional fights. Scarlet and Violet was more difficult to look at since you can fight things non-linearly, though that isn't necessarily true. Without level scaling, it does mean that the levels are set in stone, so there is a sort of route through the game following how the average trainer level increases. So, I actually sorted the battles by the metric of average trainer level to intersperse the other battles on the world with the Team Star, Titan and Gym Leader battles. This is being as charitable as I can to Scarlet and Violet, to say that it has some sort of difficulty curve, instead of you stomping a lot of the battles with a far out-leveled team. But even with that, it's mostly a cakewalk until you get to the only trainers with 6 Pokemon. Seems to be the case again like Sword and Shield. Jazz, you may be saying, you don't have to fight everyone. To which I reply, okay, tough guy. I did worry originally this would be another load of scrubbing through video footage, but I had a revelation. I could just dive headfirst into the sexiest sub-community of gamers, speedrunners. They would obviously avoid every trainer that was unnecessary, which is helpful. So here are the interesting difficulty curves based purely on mandatory fights. So if we take this 25% higher level as the cap of where you just can't beat a team higher than that, surprisingly, most of the games from Generation 1 to 5 are quite reasonable until you get to the Elite Four. This shocked me most in Pokemon Red and Blue, as I thought you'd be quite considerably outmatched. Genuinely, you probably could get through most of these games without much of an issue. Even Black and White 2, you can actually beat a lot of the Elite Four if you get past the 3 previous spikes from opponents having 6 Pokemon. This all changes as expected in Generation 6 with Pokemon X and Y. If we take the mandatory fights, you can probably reliably defeat every trainer in the game fighting just the mandatory fights. Even against Diantha. Looking through the level difference, in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, Steven Stone might possibly be too high leveled for the player to deal with. Scarlet and Violet is all over the place, and the battles with Cassiopeia and Penny are probably the most difficult to deal with. But you can tackle them in any way since it's an open world game. So it's possible that you can just deal with some of the other mandatory fights like Eureka, Poppy and the other Elite Four, and then come back to Cassiopeia and Penny, which would be an easier route, so it's possible that you can deal with them. Overall, that shows, yes, Pokemon games have been getting easier, especially since Generation 6, Pokemon Red and Blue were the hardest and required the most unforgiving grinding, with Pokemon X and Y possibly the easiest. And so if you took the average level difference at all of these milestones, you get the following results for optional and mandatory. So if we're talking mandatory fights, Black and White is actually toughest, but with every fight available, Red and Blue is toughest, while X and Y sweeps every other category as being the easiest game. But some of the milestones are things like one legendary, so I will actually narrow it down to very specific milestones. The starting rival, the 8 gym leaders, the enemy team's major leader fight, the Elite Four and the champion, since all games basically follow this format, even Scarlet and Violet. It doesn't actually change much to the results, it just makes Red and Blue much tougher than Black and White on both fronts. Oh, and on a side note, I did actually test the level scaling. I lied, I have nothing better to do. What I found is that with the optional fights, the level scaling only boosts it marginally by 0.4 levels. When experience share is used in the optional fights, it actually reduces the team's level by 2.5 on average, with Sun and Moon being the largest change, losing over 5 levels. But then if you look at the mandatory fights, it increases the party's level by 5 on average, Scarlet and Violet being the standout here, increasing by 8.8 levels. This does add 3.8 and 5.8 party levels to Black and White 2 for their mandatory fights, but doesn't add enough to make the N and Getsis fights beyond the 25% winnable threshold. Conversely, with Gen 7 and onwards, this only makes the fights easier if you fight the mandatory battles, and still too easy for the optional fights. Scarlet and Violet get a boost of 5.1 party levels, which may just be enough to defeat Cassiopeia and Penny now. In conclusion, we have learned that yes, Pokemon games are getting easier. They were following that trend until X and Y broke the difficulty curve entirely. While it eliminated a lot of the meaningless grinding, which is fantastic, it also took away all challenge from essentially the first gym battle onwards due to the revamped experience share and affection experience bonus. Subsequent games haven't been quite as bad, but often lead your team to being about 20 to 30 levels too strong at the end of the game, with maybe the cleanest difficulty curve to provide a challenge being actually to avoid any unnecessary fight. We've also learned that the amount of Pokemon enemy trainers hold has been steadily decreasing as the years go on, as well as fewer trainers in general, which give out more experience per fight. The games have been getting slowly longer and longer in the time it takes to complete the main story, with surprisingly fewer hours for post-game content, instead choosing to focus on upcoming DLCs. Looking at these graphs, the time between getting starters, the first gym, and the first rival battle have been steadily increasing. For context, the battles and how long it takes to defeat each Pokemon have stayed quite similar across all games. So this means the battles are taking the same amount of time as before with fewer trainers to fight. Yet the length of the game keeps increasing, so they are filling the space with fluff. Slow, drawn-out cutscenes and dialogue, even in Scarlet and Violet, the supposed open-world exploring game, where Breath of the Wild will throw you into the game and allow you to explore, Scarlet and Violet continues with the barrage of dialogue to over-explain the mechanics. The games are clearly marketed to a younger audience, and I'm a 150-year-old bloke who's crunching the numbers on the public's favourite Michael Vick simulator. I understand these games probably just aren't for me anymore. While technically there is a small amount of level scaling done since Gen 5, it really isn't enough. The figures do show that something more drastic with level scaling would be needed for a more engaging system. But honestly, with my game design cap on, that wouldn't make a better game and fix the core issue. It simply isn't fun mindlessly mashing A until you win with no strategy. If you're trying to be a throwaway piece of media for the casual audience, and Game Freak are happy with that being where Pokemon stays for the future, then fine, churn out these games every year. But if they do actually want to impact the genre and the industry with something that reinvigorates the fanbase, a la a Breath of the Wild for Zelda, unfortunately a bigger overhaul of the battle system and enemy AI is needed to create something special. But I guess only time will tell.